You're listening to the Go Get Them Show. This is a discussion that inspires entrepreneurs to pursue their passion to create meaningful, impactful, and sustainable companies in Asia, Africa, and LATAM. This is your host, Maxon T, together with my co-hosts, Arun Krishnakumar and Sheila Amburu. We sit down with entrepreneurs, operators, and investors across frontier markets to discover their experiences, lessons learned, and how they made an impact. So,
that there's a huge digital divide between the rural ecosystems and urban populations. And
the work I have done at the World Food Program, we had been very involved in school feeding programs, school meal programs.
Cool. You're listening to the Go Get Them Show. For this episode, we have a very, very special guest. We have Sumer Johal. For those who do not know, Sumer is the founder and CEO of AgriLogics, a big data startup dedicated to solve problems in global food and industry. Specifically, AgriLogics teams applies computer algorithms to solve problems in resource use, nutrient management, food traceability, nutrition, sustainable pest management, and more. Sumer is also a strategic advisor at FTW Ventures. FTW is an early-stage venture investing firm in world-changing food and agriculture tech startups. He's also an executive director at AgStack, a project of the Linux Foundation aimed at creating free, community-led, and open digital infrastructure for the food and agriculture stakeholders globally. He has deep expertise in software, clean tech, AgTech. Before starting AgriLogics, Sumer was the CEO at Acme Corporation, helping companies to grow in the clean and energy tech space. He was also a CTO and co-founder of Pivotal Systems, which is a spin-out of Advanced Energy Industry Data Management Division. Prior to that, he spent time as a CTO at Advanced Energy Industry, CTO and VP Engineering at Exemplify, and VP of Engineering at Z-Tribe. Sumer graduated from the MIT with a master's in electrical engineering and computer science, as well as a bachelor's in electrical engineering. Welcome to the show, Sumer.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Arun. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you for hosting.
Awesome. First question I have, you have such an amazing career and working in, I guess, some of the hardest problems, at least how I see it, right? You have been working, I guess, in the convergence of data strategy, technology, and impact. And specifically, around these three disciplines, what are things that excite you most and why?
Great question. Thank you again for having me. My story is really about, to understand the answer to my question, a little context would be useful. Mm-hmm. I grew up in an agricultural family. My father, grandparents, were all in agriculture. And so I grew up in an agrarian society in northern India in the state of Punjab. And I came to the US when I was a teenager. So this was many moons ago. But that early, childhood connected to the earth and connected to food production really, I think, colored my outlook. And as I grew in age as well as in my professional career, I started thinking more and more about the consequences and the impact that technology could have for really important topics that are really existential. And in light of climate change, in light of global population growth, in light of geopolitical transformations happening in due to social media, what we see is our society is really transforming and is faced with some really daunting challenges. But actually, as a technologist, those challenges are really opportunities. And so I look at those challenges and say, this is why people become engineers, right? As an engineer, I look at it and say, wow, this would be fantastic. We could do it this way or that way. And so I think the natural curiosity of a farmer's son, coupled with the skilling of an engineer, kind of lens applied to this world of challenges / opportunities, colors my view in a certain way that really excites me about what is possible. And those are the things that really drive me to do what I do. And I must say, it's one of the most exciting times to me to be alive. I think it's really in the scope of human history, we've never ever had the tools, the ability to connect to each other, the ability to influence, the ability to really, work across the globe in such a seamless way as we do today. And I think those are extremely exciting and great palette of tools and colors to be able to color our future and solve some of these problems.
Awesome. You mentioned, sorry, or just the one that I had to ask. You mentioned there are a lot of challenges, especially I guess in the different parts of the world. What are some of the main challenges that you're looking to solve at the moment?
Yeah, so I think the again, my own context is that there's a huge digital divide between the rural ecosystems and urban populations. And agriculture, which is not just about farmers, but just generally speaking is about these rural ecosystems. Those two ecosystems have huge, kind of different needs. And I see that the big challenge being able to provide rural ecosystems and agri-centric ecosystems with the tools, the skills, the ability to problem solve around food production, health, education. Those kinds of things in rural ecosystems are very important. More than half of our population in the world lives in those rural ecosystems. And those people are very, very important for all of us. Not only should we be thinking about them as human beings that we should care about, but we should also be thinking about them as the phenomenal underutilized resource that the world can use to really transform. And what can we empower those people with, those populations with, such that their livelihoods, and because of our dependence on them, our livelihoods dramatically improve. And from that color, I think technology and information technology in particular has some transformative possibilities that are really exciting around food production, food logistics, food nutrition, food safety, ecological resource management, water. Those are all interconnected. And I think that information technology has a huge role to play in enabling these stakeholders to not only solve the problems with technology and information, but actually connect to each other and solve it together. People talk about a divided society. I see information technology as the possibility to bring people together. And I think that is very real and a very powerful thing.
Thanks, Sumer. So when you were talking about Punjab, I just was reminded of something. I was about to say that because we just had our Delpos Ventures virtual drink. We do that regularly, and Kulpreet, who's actually out of Punjab, she was talking about her childhood, where there would be no artificial lights, and the paddy fields would light up just out in with the light from the moon and the stars. And she was talking about how she misses those days. So I can really see how much that kind of upbringing kind of attaches you to agriculture. It's just amazing. And I remember my childhood days with similar, because I'm from a village as well, with rice fields around my place, and we used to be running around without even footwear on these in these fields. So it's so amazing. Now, on that note, you are the executive director at AgStack. So maybe double clicking into that a little bit. Please tell us about that initiative at Linux Foundation. What inspired that? What is your mission around that? And in 10 years' time, what would you think? Okay, I think we've made it. What would that kind of vision be?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. Yeah, so as I went through this journey in ag tech, one of the things I realized, and there were two things I realized. First thing I realized was that a lot of what we were building was actually non-proprietary infrastructure. If you wanted to manage satellite data, there was all this, tooling that we had to build to kind of take this data and manipulate it, or weather information or soil information. A lot of this information was actually public. It was free. is still free. But to use it required this tooling and all this infrastructure, which we were building. It was not proprietary, and we were spending a lot of time building and maintaining it. And I realized that that's something that we shouldn't do just for ourselves. Everybody has the need. So why not do something in open source? And open source, meanwhile, over the last 10 years, has really taken over the world. In some ways, the famous saying is that software is eating the world and open source is eating software, right? And so open source is just this massive, technological, transformation that is happening in the world of Silicon Valley, which I live in. And, when I saw what I was doing, it's very natural inclination was, well, this should be open source. Why are we doing it just for ourselves? It has no proprietary benefit and everybody can benefit from it. And then I started looking at open source and seeing, well, why do some open source projects really succeed and others don't succeed? And there are many reasons, but one of them was that, you have to design open source such that the community can really come together around that open source and start to contribute in a way that helps everybody. And so convening that community, I started looking at examples. What are the examples of where people have done? And Linux was the example that came to my mind. I use Linux, but Linux is one of those operating system stories that has really changed the face of computing over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, when operating systems were just coming out, this big battle between proprietary and closed and open, and Linux was on the open side, and nobody really paid attention to it. There's a bunch of crazy people, right, sitting around coding and doing it for free and thinking they can change the world. Actually, they did. Okay, they created a free piece of software that's completely free. Okay, it's very high performance and quality, and today it powers every single cloud provider, including Microsoft's cloud. Right? It powers government infrastructure. It powers atomic clocks. It powers nuclear submarines. It powers everything. And it's completely free, right? How did that happen, right? And I think when we look at that, the kind of elements that it took to get there, that's what I studied. And I studied it for a couple of years in the 2018, 2019 timeframe. So by the end of that, studying period, I realized, okay, I think this is the direction we want to go. So I reached out to the Linux Foundation and said, we want to do something like what you did, but for agriculture and food. And so they said, well, it turns out we now enable other organizations to follow our governance model. And we can actually host a project for you like we did for automotive, like we did for energy, like we did for multimedia. If you're driving a car, chances are your car is running on open source project coming from the Linux, automotive grade Linux project, which is a sub project of the Linux Foundation. If you ever watched a Marvel movie, right, chances are the special effects, 80% of the special effects come from the Linux Foundation's open source projects, right? So, if you've ever turned on a light bulb, the grid that runs in the United States, for example, a lot of the grid operators use Linux Foundation's project. So they had done these projects for other industries, but not one for ag. So it was a meeting of the minds between their management and me, and a few other people that I was talking with. The University of California, for example, was very active with me. Their leadership had also realized that actually, this needs to happen and happen at scale, at globe scale, starting with maybe California or the United States, but really expanded to the rest of the world. And it was just one of those things that started to converge. One thing led to another, and it's sort of like just kind of organically happened. We said, okay, let's launch this thing. And before we knew it, we had hundreds of meetings, dozens of people joined, and we're still very young, we're still very small, but man, it has really in the grand scheme of things been tremendously received, because everybody has the same pain point, turns out. So both people who are creating content in the digital space for ag tech and people who are consuming content in the digital space for ag tech both get the benefit of this underlying infrastructure that the Linux Foundation's AgStack project is building, which is what I'm leading. And that's how it came about.
Cool. You mentioned that you bring about quite a few people, and you have I would say a very good traction. I like to understand a little bit. If it's okay to go into details, like who are some of the key stakeholders and how are they using, I guess, AgStack to help their specific use cases, right? Because I'm quite interested, like you said, Linux has
Sure.
been applied across different types of things, and now you're building one specifically for agriculture, and how are they using it in agriculture, or perhaps they're using it for other things as well. So
Sure, happy to give some examples.
yeah.
So, as I mentioned, AgStack is really the infrastructure layer that we're building, very much like an operating system, but it's not an operating system. It's more of an infrastructure on which applications can be created and also consumed. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's the idea. Let me give you an example. If I'm building an ag tech application for, let's say, predicting a pest on a particular field, a pest pressure. Let's say I want to predict, I want to write an application that predicts whether I will have a pest pressure on this field, my field of rice or something like that, in the next 7 days. I would like to know the weather, because it turns out that the weather affects the confluence of the conditions which are ripe for disease and invertebrate pests. So I didn't know this, but as I've learned more about entomology and agronomy and other types of things, it turns out the world is so connected. As the weather shifts, it actually shifts the reproductive and phenological progression and growth cycle of invertebrates, which are diseases and pests also. Okay. So not just crops, but diseases and pests. So if you want to predict the pressure of a disease on a particular crop, you have to actually get access to the weather information for the area that your crop is in. And so it's a complicated thing to digest, but actually it makes sense intuitively, because pests and crops have evolved together, right? And so they're living things that live together in a biodiverse ecosystem. And so we have to kind of look at them together. And to look at them together, they only function, they will function very systematically in a changing environment. So if you get access to the weather, you can actually do a pretty good job, first order, of predicting that, right? So if you ever want to build applications that predict pest pressure, you actually need to know two key things. One is the weather, and the second is the models that take that weather and predict pest pressure for a particular type of crop, right? Both those things actually exist already. So the weather systems, NOAA has 180,000 weather stations around the world. Every airport, every place in the world has a weather system, and it's all free and all open. Okay. But it's a real royal pain to kind of try to figure out how to download this data, how to put it together. Wouldn't it be nice? Let's say you have an iPhone, you want to write an app. You don't have to worry about where am I going to get the GPS system, right? You just say, get me GPS location, right? And you don't have to worry about how's a satellite triangulating with the various things. I mean, that's something that the satellite guys can figure out. So the infrastructure for you, the digital infrastructure to call the GPS location or the camera or whatever, you don't have to worry about it as an application developer, isn't it? And so from that point of view, if we could make a simple call and say, I just want the weather for this lat long, just give me the weather, one endpoint, one line of code, lat long, and get me the weather. I want maximum minimum temperature. And then have another repository where you have kind of a library of pest models where you can say, okay, I have the weather. Now, which pest model? I have this pest model. Here's the weather. Give it to the pest model. Pest model, tell me, am I going to have pests or not? Right? An application developer just wants to do that. Everything more than that is actually just burden. So we want to take that burden away, right? And that's an example of what this underlying infrastructure can do. There are many other elements. There are pub sub elements. There are repositories. There are tagged image libraries. There's all kinds of things. But, we are going to put them into an organized structure such that the application developers and the application users are able to quickly, an application user, has 5 different applications. They all have different information from different sources. They don't know sort of which one to use. There's no interoperability. So creating some interoperability underlying infrastructure is also very important. So I think those are the 2 examples I would give for why this infrastructure is useful. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. And sorry, just to jump in, I mean, in my head, it feels like a plaid in the sense that you're connecting all your banking data out to applications. And I love that. And especially in agriculture, it's very fragmented, like you said, and people just don't understand what does it mean from a fragmented data perspective. So I love it. Sorry, Arun, over to you.
Sure. So you mentioned upon a very important point there, Sumer, which is infrastructure for the agri space. And over the last 15 years, something that I've been fortunate enough to watch is, for instance, how the telecoms infrastructure has helped financial inclusion in Africa. And more recently, in the last 5 years or so, how the geo revolution has helped the last mile digital connectivity in India. So we all have seen that there is the almost when you deploy infrastructure at scale, it kind of brings the livelihood of people up in many ways. So on that note, this I totally appreciate. This has to be done at scale, and it has to be done by someone who's got that ability to kind of do it at scale, and Linux Foundation is clearly one of them. So what are the initiatives that you spoke about the problems you're solving, but what are the initiatives that or plans that you have, and kind of the partners that are coming into this ecosystem that can help you scale? If you can give us some, of course, there is some
Sure. Happy to do so. Yeah, so we have, the Linux Foundation has built a tiered membership structure. So we have members, and members contribute. Members also provide manpower, but non-members can also contribute as well. Members just provide governance on the direction in which the project needs to go. So we have more than a dozen members now, just in the last 2-3 months. Several for-profit companies in the tech space. You can look at our launch announcement, and several non-for-profit research organizations like universities have also joined. Our goal is to have hundreds of universities across the world be members, and hundreds, maybe thousands of for-profit companies to be our members as well as we grow. But that has just begun, and now we have more than a dozen members. So the members are, working together on 10 different topics. All 10 topics are part of this infrastructure. And so these 10 topics are on our Slack channel on AgStack. People can check it out. And, the weather server I just mentioned is one of those topics, for example. There are other topics. There's one topic for ag extension. There's one topic on machine learning. There's all kinds of topics. So these members convene these topics and work with other contributors. We have dozens of developers who join pro bono. And that's the magic of this whole thing. It's really magical, right? You just kind of, broadcast, we need help to do this for the world, and the world responds. It's just magical how that happens. It's really thrilling to see it. And very capable people with PhDs, people with dozens of years of experience. I mean, on the weather stuff, we have some people who've been working in meteorological organizations and really know what they're talking about. And, we're talking about long-term climate forecasts for, horticulture, all kinds of things. So that's how it comes together. And the way we, our role as the management of AgStack is to facilitate, to coach, to guide, to encourage, and, sometimes to kind of mediate if there's too much, conflict, which hasn't happened so far, but I'm sure it'll happen one day. And the Linux Foundation provides an entire governance structure. We have our former charter. We have, former, resources at the Linux Foundation we can draw upon for various things as we need fit. So that helps us really reduce the time and effort it takes to actually put this together. We're able to sort of focus on the work and get it done. that's how it happens. And I think in the next 30 days, we'll be launching an internal weather server just for our internal testing. And I think end of this year, we'll be launching our first alpha release. So, I hope I answered that question in terms of how the governance works.
Absolutely. Thank you, Max.
Cool. I want to switch gear a little bit. Right, we talk about AgStack. I also know that you're also a senior advisor at strategic advisor at FTW Ventures. So I guess from a investor perspective, right, what are some of the more interesting trends that you're looking at now? And I think specifically, I'm quite interested to understand like why now, right? There's certain problems that we won't be able to solve. One of it could be, possibility of AgStack open up more and more opportunities. But what are other underlying factors that's changing? Yeah. So
I think broadly speaking, I'm very interested in the entire supply chain of our food. And when I say supply chain, not just the supply piece, but also the resource piece, the environmental, the water. There's a lot of pieces to it. But the entire, chain, you can look at it from a supply perspective, but you can also look at it from a demand perspective. So if you look at the demand perspective, consumers are changing the way we consume our food. People are more aware of what food they're eating. People are more aware of nutrition. People are more aware of health. And there's massive shifts happening on the demand side of food, which are going to have a massive effect on the supply side. Okay. These demand changes are what is actually changing agribusiness and food, the retail, food service, the entire food spectrum, both in terms of packaged foods, fresh foods, and commodities. The entire spectrum is shifting because consumers are shifting. And when people go from, meat alternatives, for example, because of climate change, or people go to, high protein cereals, right? Or people go to, vegan diets that have, very low allergies.
Yeah.
Or, I'm just giving examples. I'm not prescribing any one of these lifestyles, but the fact remains that, 20 years ago, organic was like a joke. If we went to my farming family in California or even in India and say, hey, somebody wants organic, they would just laugh at you and say, what the heck is this organic nonsense? And, well, what are you doing? And we're like, well, you got to reduce the chemicals and this and that. Like, yeah, okay, well, how are we going to produce food so people don't starve to death? But what happened is the consumers, they demanded change. Right? They said, look, we don't want chemical loading in our food. We want organic. We want governments to regulate what that certification means. And guess what? It's the fastest growing production segment, in food production. So, the consumer trends are a big change that is happening. The second change that's happening is the shift towards health and food. Food as the original medicine. People are looking at food from a perspective of not just, existing and basically surviving, but thriving. How can I get my food in a way that improves my performance, improves my lifestyle, improves my quality of life? And I think that is not just a Western trend. That is something that is happening everywhere. In fact, we have all old traditions in Chinese culture, in Indian culture, in any old culture, using, food as the original ingredients to treat various types of disorders. And, that is actually reviving and coming full circle and also influencing this whole supply chain. So with, venture firms and with investors, what I like to kind of guide folks towards is to look at not where the business environment is, but where it is going to be. And where it is going to be is that consumers are going to demand food that is better for their health, is better for the environment, and it is something that is better for the producers. So I think all three things have to coexist if we are going to basically succeed. You cannot have a win-loss. So if you demand a food that the producer cannot supply, well, then the producer cannot supply it, right? So that won't work. So ultimately, all three elements have to win. And so that's where some of the investment thesis that is being developed, that's the coloration behind it. So I would give guidance to entrepreneurs to sort of think from a systems perspective, not so much from a, solving just a problem or a symptom, but think about the entire system and think about what role can your technology, your product, or your service have on that entire system, not in what it is today, but what you think it might be in 20 years, because that is where the market will grow. You see those trends with vertical farming, for example. You see those trends with, meat alternatives, etc.
Thanks, Sumer. I'm itching to ask one last question, and I promise we'll close
By the
this
way,
at that. So you've been involved in a startup. You've been involved within agriculture. You've been involved in a startup. You've been an investor, and now you're involved in a open source, not for profit kind of a space. What is your thought about the whole kind of from a systemic perspective to resolve some of the pain points that we have in the agri-tech space? Which route do you think is there a silver bullet to solving this?
really, there isn't a silver bullet. I think that anybody who says there is misguided. Agri-tech and agriculture is a global, hyper-connected constellation of stakeholders, and it's complex, it's multinational, it's just a very vast and important and complex area. So it's very hard to tease out one thing that's going to change everything. But having said that, I will say that I'm really excited about this new wave of open source and inclusive technology development around communities, where communities can build their own technology for themselves with shared ownership. This notion of shared ownership of technology is now, over the last 10 years, proven out to be one of the most successful commercial innovations in Silicon Valley. Okay. And so now if you take that for the rest of the world, right, and say the next 20 years, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to create collaboration where we are not competing all the time. We compete, but we also collaborate. We collaborate on pre-competitive pieces that we all need. And then we compete on, my thing is better than yours, but let's say that the infrastructure may be the common thing. So I personally feel that the work in collaboration, bringing people together to solve problems, and really, the saying about going far with others, going fast alone, but going far with others, I think that saying is very true. And that's one of the reasons why this community-based collaboration is very exciting to me, technically as well as from an impact point of view.
That's awesome, Sumer. Go far together, fast alone. That's a nice way to finish the conversation. Thank you so much for your brilliant insights. It's always been a pleasure talking to you since I've known you, and thanks for making time for us today.
It was my absolute pleasure, Arun and Max. Thank you so much for convening these important topics, and really a delight. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sumer.